the presentation that I'm discussing is research that goes as far back as the early days of the Egyptian Revolution in 2009, 2010, and then the massive uprising that many of us heard about and followed in the news in 2011, the so-called January 25th Revolution, and its implications for meaning-making and digital afterlives for communities in Egypt and also beyond that. The reason why this is important now is because when we think about authoritarianism and how it manifests and the ways in which digital practices and praxis are infringed upon by both institutions, whether those be corporate or state, we see patterns sort of repeating themselves. Of course, there are contemporary examples of this in the form of either sort of algorithmic bias or shadow banning and other mechanisms, but there are also pre-digital approaches, which is basically to utilize the digital divide to disenfranchise people by essentially pulling the plug and trying to avoid their ability to participate in these spaces altogether. And so also in light of that, when we talk about the mobilizations and the protest movements in the region, both and beyond, in at least 5 or 6 different countries of the world, which was then called the Arab Spring, there was a fairly substantial amount of valorization and celebration of these movements. Now, these movements don't really differ much from the student protests that are now unfolding in North America, but while some were valorized, others have been demonized. And in fact, some of the individuals who were themselves actively involved in the protest movements in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, in Bahrain, and other places, including later in Sudan and elsewhere, many of those individuals were themselves, and some of them continue to be students at universities across North America. And so as they begin to see themselves holding similar kind of encampments and protests and just utilizing the same tools that have been imparted to them during those uprisings in those respective countries, when they bring them home to the seats of democratic practice and power, we see how authoritarianism envisions itself and manifests itself through military industrial practices. And so it raises the question of what does it mean to be doing democratic work, and how do revolutionary practices continue to live on through meaning making and perhaps even through satire, when all circumstances and all avenues for change have effectively been exhausted. So this study started during the early days of the revolution in Egypt and continues to this day because it really is about the afterlives of meaning making. And I'm very much interested in memes specifically, and memes as forms of meaning. And so there are different permutations of this title, but one of them is Theorizing Authority and Authorship in Arab New Media. For those of you who are familiar with memes, I need not spend too much time on that, but I just will really quickly. Of course, most of us are accustomed to memes now because they're part of our day-to-day interaction with politics, with society, and with our own experiences of ourselves and our meaning making as members of social communities and various aggregations. But one could say that the origin of the term meme and how it's utilized in digital spaces comes from Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene, which offers the term as indicative of expression, a function of communication that is transferable and modifiable, within which imbued meaning constructs an interpretive idea. It comes from evolutionary biology, and the term has taken on or implied either hereditary yet mutable connotations. So we know that while genes manifest themselves and they come from a pre-existing sort of codified template, if you will, that through mutations and through transformation and through recombination, genes have ways of manifesting themselves differently. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this degree of variation in all sort of organic life. So through crossbreeding or in the form of cultural realms, hybridization, of course, we see that the transference of the term and its utilization in the cultural space. at crossbreeding or hybridization or creolization or bricolage terms that imply or signify transformation and transference, that they produce novel forms with residual relatability and traceable to the genealogy. And that's, I think, a really important characteristic of memes as we think about them. The front page of this slide is actually a picture of the current president of Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, against the backdrop or in the center of the Egyptian flag, with himself kind of ominously staring people down. This is a meme that circulates very widely and periodically, depending on the performance of the Egyptian state. So whenever the president comes down with a draconian decree of some sort, they're like, ah, here it is again. So instead of having like there's a falcon in the middle of the Egyptian flag, it's replaced by Sisi's sort of glaring eyes. Oops, sorry. Is there a way to? There we go. Okay, things are going to keep popping up. Yep. So I think we have to kind of click. Oh, can I do that?
Yeah.
All right. So there are three basic categories that I'm interested in to explore memes and meaning making in the context of the Egyptian revolution, but also Arab media in general. The first is sardonic power. The second is recombinant intertextuality, and the third is nostalgic immediacy. And I'll explore those and explain those in the time that I have as best. Or I'm sorry, there's a fourth category as well. I'm forgetting myself. And the fourth is participatory folklore. And you'll see that, I mean, there's actually so much context in a lot of the images that I'm going to show. I'm not going to belabor you with it, but just by looking at it, you can begin to see kind of themes that may be resonant with meme production and meme generation in your respective sort of community spaces and what you might be familiar with, because a lot of these patterns are very much interchangeable. So in this case, for example, it is this comes from a panel on the Egyptian constitution. It is a new constitution for a new country that is emerging out of a revolutionary moment. And this is the panel that is, that is responsible for drafting the first constitution of this new republic. And you can see above that it says all Egyptians' constitution. But when you look at the images, all of these have been photoshopped to reflect the same face of the Egyptian president. So he's a farmer, he's a doctor, he's a police officer, he's a military man, he's all of these different personas. He is everyone in Egypt. And so all Egyptians are a reflection of the president. So this is a critique of the very act of producing a constitution where every member of the constitutional panel, the parliamentary panel, is chosen or appointed or vetted by the president. So the president's the only one really drafting the constitution. So let's start with this notion of sardonic power. The notion of sardonic power is premised on the idea that that one is actively trying to decimate authority in the channels and avenues and platforms that one has active access to and disposal of. So, for example, arguably in an authoritarian environment, the ability to utilize public space is limited. The ability to push against private institutions is also quite limited. Securitization and carceralization of space becomes quite limited. So the online spaces become the only avenue, despite surveillance and active policing of those spaces, they become the only realm within which some of this information is circulating. So just by looking at things here, you can see, there's the infantilization or the challenging of authority. And on the left-hand side, you see a picture of the former president of Egypt sitting on a potty, and I'll save you like all the details, but basically you can see how, and in some cases there's a lot of use of profanities, the kinds of things that cannot be verbalized in public space. But for example, in the center, you see a picture of the president of Egypt at the time, the minister of defense, and there's a horrible profanity about him, but it's sort of like, happy birthday, you such and such, and I'm going to save you the epithets. So this is all, the ways in which authority is decimated by reducing those in power into not only subjects of criticism, but reducing them to almost dehumanized, entities that punctures the public pomposity around their representations. And this is a very, very critical role for memes. And we've seen that, and we see that quite frequently with almost all sort of authority figures in those spaces. So you can say that about any other sort of meme community elsewhere. But in this case, this was dedicated to the Egyptian context. On the top right-hand corner, you can see here a picture of Karl Marx and a quote, but it's not actually a real quote. It's a fake quote. It's in Arabic, it says, "Islam is the solution." And that's a slogan of the Islamist group, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And so by juxtaposing the expression of, Islam is the solution with Karl Marx, it actually deflates the arguments of the Muslim Brotherhood, because it demonstrates their lack of commitment to egalitarianism and support for worker rights and things of that sort. So it's really sort of a play on these different elements. Some of the visual dimensions come from images that are photoshopped. For example, in the center top, this is a screenshot from a famous film. And, these are individuals, who are characters in this film. It's a group of young men whose sole purpose in this film, the sort of the narrative arc, is around them trying to watch a pornographic film on a VHS tape, but they can't seem to get all the different elements. So they're either missing a VHS player or a place to watch it in a country that is quite conservative religiously. And then all of a sudden, at the very end, you see a member of that group that is actively trying to find a place to watch this pornographic film, and it's a presidential candidate. And so in doing so, they take the sort of the air of authority from the presidential candidate and reduce him to a young, sort of newly pubescent man seeking, gratification from a pornographic film or something of the sort. Now, these things would have been unheard of prior to the revolutionary moment, which implies that nothing is holy anymore. Religious institutions are being challenged, political authority is being challenged, and social norms and taboos are also being challenged. And this is the element of meme making that is focused on sardonic power, the use of laughter or irony through the juxtaposition of elements of power with powerlessness or with vulgarity or with profanity. The second element is what I've been calling recombinant intertextuality. And really what I'm trying to describe here is the sort of layering of discourses. Discourses one atop the other. Some of these discourses are dislocated and relocated from cultural artifacts. Obviously, for those who've watched The Simpsons over the years, this is a scene from the theme song in the beginning where Homer Simpson is poorly handling radioactive material at a nuclear power plant. And so you see here, it takes this very, very known, of course, if you know this, you're kind of already being aged, but because I don't know if people are still watching The Simpsons, but it's been running for, I don't know, like maybe 15, 20 seasons. I have lost track, but I don't know if it's still part of popular culture. What is it?
It's
30 years? My goodness. Okay, I'm totally being aged. I remember, I'm not gonna say I remember the first season, but
I remember the first season.
you and me both. So the idea here is recombinant. Why do I use the word recombinant? Recombinant essentially implies that each piece and each element of the meme has a genetic imprint. Okay, it has a history, it is traceable, it's self-generated, and is also embedded in signification. It has meaning, you can trace it. So for instance, Homer Simpson in this case has traceable meaning. In the background, on the top right-hand corner, you see something inscribed in Arabic. That's actually a Quranic verse. It has meaning to people who can read it, and it's traceable, and it signifies something. And so all of these different elements, including, of course, the message below, which is a politicized critique of the president, but also speaks to a collective communitarian knowledge about the political moment. And of course, so that's the recombinant component. The intertextual is one that allows the image itself to cross genres, media, platforms, and dimensions, including also sort of histories. The other component that I became really interested in, I feel it fits into the notion of recombinant intertextuality, is the notion of liminality, that the internet as a space for globalization, that memes are both hybrid and at once both hybrid and also sort of delocalized, but also incredibly situated. So for example, this meme only makes sense to people who understand every element of that recombination. But nevertheless, there are enough cues of signification that allow us to know that this is meant to represent satire or critique or something of the sort. So, but nevertheless, the recombinant intertextuality is a grounded foundation to the understanding of memes in these particular political contexts. The third component is sort of what I'm calling nostalgic immediacy. And you can see that there is a tension in those two terms, that nostalgia implies our connection to the past and longing for the estranged, distant, past and trying to reconstitute it in some way. And then, of course, there's immediacy, which implies like something that is immediate and the here and now. So playing with that temporality is a critical part of how some of these memes are being generated. So temporal frames are collapsed as the nostalgic connection to the historically situated texts that are familiar. I mean, in the absence of familiarity, we lose nostalgia. Like it has to be something that means something to someone. So for example, in this particular image, there's a very famous, most of you know who this person is, but he's an iconic Egyptian singer he died in 1977, so between 1950s and 1970s, and he has very famous songs. He would stand in front of a microphone and sing for an hour and a half with a full orchestra behind him, and his music became iconic for the moment. Most of my parents' generation would know who he is, and his songs have lived on and are played quite frequently. And so what happens is they take the chorus of one of the most famous songs and they modify it in such a way so as to critique a government policy. Okay, so in this case, it says, I'm going to pronounce it in Arabic and then translate. جلست والخوف بعينيها تتأمل دستور المسلوب, which basically means it's about a woman reading someone's coffee cup. It's sort of like reading one's palm, reading their future. I don't know if you know this about Middle Eastern culture. You flip the Turkish or Arab coffee, and then the residual coffee forms a pattern, and people sometimes read it, and and it's a way to kind of premonition or prophetically interpret where their future is going to go. And so in this song, he's narrating where the cup is overturned, and this woman who knows about reading the future is reading it and telling him about how he's going to lose his loved one or something of the sort. So he says, she sat with fear in her eyes, staring at my godforsaken coffee mug, right? And in this case, the translation is, and it rhymes perfectly, staring at my boiled constitution. Now, when you boil something, it lacks flavor, it lacks context, it's not grilled, it's not seasoned. So the boiling of the constitution just means you barely cooked it. And so in this case, it's talking about the constitution and the collective misery about watching your country's constitution being drafted without any sense of purpose, meaning, direction. And so in this case, you can see those connections come into play. So they're immediate references that respond to the concerns of the day through a novel way of reproducing presentism through nostalgia. And this is something that is part of the national collective psyche. People would immediately recognize this song, and they could even sing it. And of course, when the meme is generated, it sometimes precipitates people reciting the song itself. So people begin to recite it, and as it becomes recited, it becomes part of new popular culture around those notions. So that's okay. The fourth component is participatory folklore, and this one is a bit strange to explain. Folklore, I mean, the term folklore is very much out of fashion in sort of media studies, communication. Really, it's out of fashion in every area, but I've become really interested in it because when we think about popular culture, there's a sense that popular culture is all about things trending and changing and shifting. But folklore or folklore studies, and there's a whole sort of body of literature, and it used to be quite popular in even in the areas of anthropology and sociocultural studies, sociology. There were open discussions about what folklore constitutes, the things that become that are emboldened by collective values to the extent they become almost immutable in their foundations. And so what does folklore mean? Now, of course, we now know through mimetic analysis that things are always subject to change and are always subject to modification. But what are those foundations? And so in the context of analyzing memes in the Egyptian political context, I became attentive to this idea of folklore, things that are fixed social texts, songs, plays that are memorized verbatim, that people know. They are part of the foundation. And a lot of it has to do with periods in sort of media and communication innovation, where everyone consumed the same thing at the same time. Nowadays, of course, with the abundance and the amplification of messages and content being generated on so many different platforms, it is impossible for us to subsume all of that content. And so there's curation, there's sort of aggregation and disaggregation and interest and all of those different things. But there was a time when, there was one television channel or two or three television channels. Everybody watched the same news. Everybody listened to the same songs. The Billboard top 40 hits were the only hits that were on radio. And the same is true of the Middle East, where everybody consumed the same popular culture because the centers that generated culture were very scarce in number, and the amount of either films or songs produced per year were also quite limited. And so there's the tendency for that to form the folkloric foundation of a nation state, particularly during these moments of tremendous either political rapture or formative political transformation, such as moments of political independence or sort of anti-colonial wars and conflicts. That these become really hinge moments where there is a collective folklore that's generated. But the reason why they become folkloric, or the ways in which proving that they are folklore, is the extent to which that they are evoked in everyday life. Today, they're not only the lens through which most people in the country see the world and reflect about them for the first time, but they are also able to participate in manufacturing, inscribing, and recasting this folklore either through active involvement in its creation or in propagating it and disseminating it and amplifying. So, for example, this is a scene from a very famous theatrical play in Egypt that's called Al-Mutazawwijun, which means the married folks, right? And it's really about marital struggles between people, but also reflects on the incredible disparities between the wealthy and the poor in Egypt. Some people are living in the sewers, other people are living in palaces, and there's a love affair between these two individuals. And here she is, this is the young bride from a very affluent family, and she's married to this, miserably, impoverished individual who lives in the sewers, and he's taking her on a tour of his home in the sewers, right? And in this case, and everybody knows this. I would say not only do most Egyptians know this, the context through which this entire play, which is about 3.5 hours long, has been both parsed out and disaggregated and excerpted in such a way that it's turned into short videos that are widely circulating. So most young people have never watched the entire play, but have watched enough segments that they are able to piece together the narrative. But those segments alone are able to continue to live on in popular folklore because of the way in which they become relevant, either through discussions around marital sort of disparities and struggles, or because they become imbued with political messaging. So in this case, in the background, whereas this photo is supposed to be the picture of this young man's grandfather, it's been replaced by the interim president of Egypt who is shepherding the constitution. And he's looking overhead ominously. And there's a moment where this young man turns around and he's like, yeah, don't worry about my grandfather. He's just he's dead and he's cross-eyed. It's sort of ridiculing and belittling him, that he really doesn't matter. And that's where the meaning is embedded, that this interim president is not actually responsible for drafting the constitution. He is shepherding the military's constitution. So again, lots of meanings involved in it, but immediately recognizable to anybody who sees them. So resuscitating and recasting and revitalizing and reinventing folkloric texts in the contemporary context while infusing them with new life. Not unlike the online trolling of, let's say, I know for those of you, like, I feel like everything is very much, anachronistic at this point. But you remember like Rick rolling? Anybody know? You remember? Is that still a thing? It's gone now. Okay.
It's harder because there's a lot of like previews on every link
Yeah.
now, so it's harder to get someone with it.
So Greta riffled everyone.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, she actually physically sang.
Literally. See, that's a whole new level when you're able to do that. So, I mean, similar, not unlike, for example, Rickrolling and other forms of trolling. Really, and of course, what that does is it reintroduces a particular sort of folkloric, popular cultural notion, and it comes back to life, and it's reconstituted and regenerated to be heard and to live on in ways, and becomes sampled as tunes and harmonies. And of course, we see that in almost every sort of digital afterlife we look at today. Okay. Let's see. I know, how am I doing for time? I know I typically am quite
around 10
minutes.
15 minutes.
Okay. So I'm just going to give you a few really quick examples of how these types of things manifest. This is a particular meme. It's difficult to kind of read out in Arabic, but it's pronounced "Maysahash kida," which means like that's very shameful, or shame on you, or you really shouldn't do that. And so this is the original context to which this expression came out, is when the president, top left-hand corner, said it in a public speech to the nation, where people were criticizing him and saying, what the hell are you doing? Or your policies are horrendous and it's not acceptable. I mean, of course, there are many policies that many people would find unacceptable. Egypt, I can't remember the exact context of what was going on at the time, but he was being challenged quite significantly in his policies, at least online, definitely not in public space or in the streets as things were in the revolutionary moment. But as he was challenged, he didn't want to demonstrate and represent himself as an authoritarian figure. Instead, he tried to represent himself as a moral figure. Here he was very sort of paternalistically reprimanding the nation and its citizenry by telling them that what they're saying is inappropriate. Like, you don't challenge your elders, don't speak to people who are, your leaders that way. He's like, is this appropriate? Just trying to guilt trip the society. It's like, is this appropriate? Is this the right thing to do? Really? Is this the way you want to treat me? And doing it kind of in a very soft spoken way. Now, when people heard that, they're like, a lot of people, many of those who were leveling the political critique against him, they immediately, first of all, turned it into an audio track. I don't know if you know that the image in the center with the two furry Muppety things. That's a very famous song. I think it's from the 80s, from the Muppet Show. It goes do you know that? Like, I know you didn't want to hear me sing, but that's yeah, exactly. And so what people did was they took my sahish kida, and it became like the phrase, and then it would go and it just kept repeating. And that video went viral, so it immediately turned his expression into a laughable statement, not something that one could take seriously, which of course immediately deflates the guilt that he's leveling onto the public at large. And then they started printing out my sahish kida, and you can see that on the right-hand side, top right-hand corner and bottom right-hand, you can see they actually print out my sahish kida, which means this is very shameful. And then they begin to hold that piece of paper against image or real life things that are going on in the country that are very shameful. So for example, a person eating out of the garbage, someone living in trash. As they hold it up, they're like, this is what's shameful. What's shameful are the policies that are precipitating poverty and desolate life in Egypt, not your sense of well-being or work. And of course, in the center, in the bottom center, there's actually it says Maysahash Kida. It's graffiti on the wall of the presidential palace. In this case, inscribed with a particular design, usually reserved for Quranic scripture, like the way in which it's decorated and ornated. So it sends a signal that, you know, it's glorifying his statement, but also in a way making fun of it. You're like, as if this was the word of God. So God is telling you my sahish kida, and my sahish kida is a colloquial expression rather than a classical expression. So the Quran is written in classical Arabic. This is written in colloquial Arabic. So in a way, it's saying, you know, you think you're God, but you're really not. But it's also kind of codified that way. So anybody who sees this, they will laugh at it and immediately recognize how absolutely empty that is. And then, of course, in the bottom left-hand corner is another. This ended up being an animated musical sort of track that was produced representing the president singing the song My Sahashkin. And of course, those have tens of not hundreds of thousands of views. In some cases, the most popular of those memes has millions of followers. The next one is the sort of the idea of the messianic. There is a tendency for people to construct political leaders as saviors from the abyss of some sort, right? Biden saved us from a second Trump term. I don't know what's going to happen. There are so many saviors, right? So the idea of political messianism is fairly well entrenched in political life, and it's not uncommon within authoritarian governments where political transition doesn't happen either smoothly or freely, where political participation is curbed significantly, that we see the presidents utilizing the state media, but also collaborative collaborative private media as platforms for propagandizing for themselves as saviors of the republic. In this case, Sisi of Egypt came as a result of both a massive protest movement and a military coup against the previous president, Mohammed Morsi. There's a lot of context we can revisit during the Q&A, but as a result of this military coup that had popular support, he was constructed as a Superman figure, right? And in the left-hand side, you'll see an actual cartoon from a major state and public newspaper depicting Sisi carrying Egypt. That woman in a dress is Egypt, being, picked up and flown away. Look how happy she is in the arms of a Sisi. He's wearing his military cap and he's super Sisi, right? And this is not satire. This is an actual cartoon, right? This is the real deal. People are supposed to look and say, yes, thank you for saving us. Now, the juxtaposition. Now, people decided to take this caricatured image and place it onto photos of real life in Egypt. So in this case, because there's no public works, there's no urban planning, any excess rain can cause flooding. So this is a main sort of tunnel leading into an intersection in downtown Cairo because of a little bit of rain. The way we react with snow here in Vancouver, Egyptians react to rain. So this is considered a massive flood. But because there's no public works and very little it took literally hours for the municipal kind of services to show up and do something about it. They're like, well, where's Sisi to save us? And you could see here, Sisi is saving Egypt, but not really saving Egypt. That juxtaposition communicates the message. And this individual is an iconic caricaturist who's been publishing in these newspapers for almost 30, 40 years. So in the process, also, debunking the myth of the savior and the messianic, but also effectively decimating whatever semblance of authority these publications might have, or the assumption that they might be independent goes out the window when we begin to see those being reproduced. And arguably, these images are damning for the public and private media because they live on despite any criticism that might exist in those newspapers. So, for example, if this newspaper were to publish an article the very next day saying, you know what, the Sisi's government is underperforming and such, that's not going to live on as much as, or even be recognized as much as this particular meme. So once things become memes, they travel and then they are capable of creating new literacies around politics and political life. The other thing is this notion of authorship, right? And the question that this raises is, are we talking about shared authorship or individual authorship or collective. And this is a dilemma that is part of the analysis and understanding of memes, because anyone with the strong sort of desire to contribute to public discourse through the generation of memes. I mean, nowadays, of course, we've got apps that allow us to turn anything into a meme in a moment's time. But what does it mean for us to trace authorship in this context? In some cases, meme generators are individuals who want to take credit for what they believe is a craft. And so that you'll see some of them being watermarked, others will not. And of course, in cases where there's authoritarianism and there's the likelihood that people will be either arrested or persecuted or prosecuted for the generation of or the creation of political messages that are considered problematic by the state, then arguably you want to be invisible and you don't want authorship and you don't want to be traceable in any functional way. But that tension is part and parcel of how things operate, but also seems to indicate the extent to which people are invested in the political actions that they participate in. In some cases, diasporic Egyptians, diasporic Arabs, folks who are living overseas are likely to contribute to the generation of this content and take credit for it. In other cases, folks who are domestically situated are less inclined to do so. But at the same time, the essence in most cases is to get the message out. Right. And so people contribute and collaborate and find ways around restriction to be able to circulate things. So these are two really interesting memes. They don't come from the same sort of family of memes, but one of them is on the right-hand side where the president, in this case dressed in full military attire, is speaking to the people. And behind him, there's a man urinating against a tree. Right. Now, this never really happened, but because he happened to shoot this video, this public speech with what appears to be like a forest background, it allowed his political adversaries to generate something like this. Of course, it's absolutely hilarious, and then people started putting random things behind it. But this is one that circulated very widely because it seemed very natural. It's as if some guy literally walked by and took care of business there. The one on the left-hand side is actually from the logo of ISIS, right? Islamic State, the radical Islamist group that was trying to take over land and impose a very, very tyrannical and puritanical interpretation of Islamic law, but really was a political project to take over land in Iraq and Syria. So what they did was the meme generators, they took this and they actually changed it. It says Jamaat Ansar Sisi is like the rather than Islamic Republic, this is the supporters of Sisi. So they shifted it completely, like rather than it be about the Islamists, it's about Sisi. And because he plays cute and appears to be very nice and pleasant and plays the sort of the daddy role in relation to others and appears to be nurturing but also reprimanding, they put a little teddy bear and said, "I love you" inside it. And so anybody who sees this immediately recognizes that this is meant to be Sisi, that Sisi rules with an iron fist, but then gives you a hug and gives you the impression that he really loves you. Very traditional paternal. How am I doing for time? 10 seconds.
A couple minutes.
Oh my goodness. It's amazing. Thank you.
2 minutes.
All right. So what I wanted to say, and I'm not going to dwell on this, but if we expand the frame a little bit from outside Egypt to really any locale, whether in the Middle East or beyond, we begin to see the real questions around what I'm describing as like the construction of meaning through co-creation. Like, so it's semiosis, but it's semiosis through collaboration. And in some instances, this collaboration is not one that is agreed upon. There is no panel, there is no discussion, there is no workshop, there's no webinar. People don't sit together and come up with like ideas for memes, or very rarely. If they have a political project, then they can sit down and say, all right, we need memes. But for the most part, it is very, very organic and very ad hoc. But nevertheless, there is this notion of co-creation where people learn from each other, they like an idea, and they utilize it in different ways. So memes, when we think about site, and when we think about co-creation and semiosis, we're thinking about both the site and the product. So memes serve as the locale for contestation, right? So I'm moving beyond thinking about the site as the space where something happens and thinking about the meme itself as potentially the site. So memes serve as a locale for contestation and dynamic negotiation of meaning. They are a space for the convergence of otherwise dissonant and disenfranchised texts. And of course, in this case, we can think about the industrialization of memes and the labor that goes into it. And you'll remember the previous slide about this notion of authorship. Where does that labor go and how is it compensated? And in many instances, it is done just purely to contribute to political discourse, but it is nevertheless political labor. And so there's questions around that, but there is definitely a site of production. And one could think about memes not in the singularity, but as the collective, like the meme factory that is both disparate and disaggregated and very sort of amoebic, like it doesn't have any pre-defined boundaries. And the second is the product as outcomes and completed works, because again, the meme has to accomplish a goal. It's very functional. So when a meme is completed, it is capable of relaying a message and does so with a specific kind of desired impact. So as outcomes and completed works in the world to be engaged with, challenged, remixed, sampled, and distributed, and mutated, the product itself is what we are interested in. And there is nevertheless an entrepreneurship around meme production and dissemination. So in this case, these are a bunch of memes all related to a campaign in Lebanon where the government basically collapsed and continues to be collapsed to this day. Lebanon has not had a functional government for over 5 years. And one of the key moments where this became incredibly apparent is during a time where literally the garbage collectors in the country went on strike. And then because they were underpaid, and then the government could not compensate them enough. So they started, leaving their work, and then eventually the government fired them, and then there was no garbage collectors left, and the government didn't know what to do. So garbage piled up in streets and in alleys and in front of people. So people didn't know what to do with their garbage, and so it kickstarted a campaign called Tilat Rihadkum, which means your smell, we can now smell you. And it was the smell. They're basically saying we are smelling the rot of government, and so. You can see here, like whether it's the Lebanese flag, and instead of the cedar tree is holding its nose because it's stinky, or instead of the cedar leaf, there's like a garbage and it says Dawlat al-Fasad, the government of corruption. And this is the Lebanese public wanting to throw the government into the garbage, and various other iterations where the idea of garbage, which is something that people are literally witnessing, seeing, it's a all-out multi-sensory experience with garbage. And it becomes representative of government's failures and corruptions. I'm going to close with what I think is the most difficult part of working with memes. So memes are difficult to deal with because they defy taxonomy, they defy classification, and they also resist atomization. You can't really reduce them. They are mainstream, alternative, and independent. They are political, social, and cultural. They are critical cultural, but also political economic. They are, in some cases, reflections of imperial power, but sometimes they're asymmetric. They're transnational and transcultural in many instances, but also in some instances, they're extremely local and situated in cultural literacy. In some cases, they tell us a lot about consumer culture and commercialization. In other cases, we think of ourselves as consumers of them, not as consumers, but rather as audiences or users. In some cases, we are both users and producers. So where are those lines drawn? They leave us feeling like both agents and without agency. They are part of the flow that is very much centralized and contingent on the centers of power, but they're also counter flow because embedded within that, you can see that the narratives and the discourses can be counter hegemonic. They are, local, they are spatial, they're situated, they're universally, in some cases they're universal comprehensibility, in other instances they are local sensibilities, and those tensions also tell us about the degree of cosmopolitanism, both within the generators of the memes and those who interact with them. They are modernist and postmodern, libertarian, Marxist, neoliberal, but also like right-wing, when we think about progressive politics and memes, most of us end up spending a lot of time thinking about progressive memes, but in reality, so many memes are generated by conservative communities, and those too hearken to some of the same types of modalities of transference and distribution. They tell us something about democratic governance and also developmental complexes and signification. They tell us about historicism and presentism and futurism, but they're also more so than ever methodological quagmires, because to think about them textually or discursively or in terms of narrative or the political economy leaves us in these incredible sort of labyrinthine pathways where we're trying to figure out where the beginning of the product is and the end of the product is, or who's generating what. Like in many instances, unless you have the full ability to trace and understand the lineage and the experiences of a particular meme, we are left jumping to conclusions or arriving at our best interpretations of how they work. But also to think about them in a massified way, once we expand the frame quite substantially and we think about them wholesale as part of a larger either collective or movement or as large data, then they become even more difficult to understand and interpret because of the extent to which meaning is signified and imbued in every minuscule detail of those pixelated images. And then finally, why do they matter? At least as far as the Egyptian and Arab memes, the groups that circulate memes in the Arab world have some of the highest followings. And by that I mean those groups either exist on Instagram or have Facebook groups. They are some of the largest groups with the most number of followers of any political expression in the region. By that I mean they have more followers than any political figures, any political parties. And of course, the way in which they decide to curate and distribute those memes based on their own propensities, proclivities, political ideologies can help determine the extent to which they are either successful in their respective communities and their disaggregation from others along political spectrums. But by that I mean literally there's one group that circulates memes called The Boy Sitting Behind Puyol. Puyol is a Spanish football player, for those who know about Spanish football, and that has 2.4 million followers. The Muslim Brotherhood aligned meme group called the Coup Sarcasm Society has about 180,000 followers. Another Muslim Brotherhood group has about 600,000 followers, and one of the largest is called Asahbi, has about 2.3 million followers. And it continues, it goes on and on. So why do memes matter? Memes matter because they are the entanglements of often hyperbolic debates surrounding the exceptionalism of virtuality and how they inform new modes of communication and embodiment. By examining memes as both sites and products of co-creation and semiosis, I argue that temporality and spatiality speak not to the uniqueness of new media utterances, but rather to the expanded scope of mundane practice. That said, mundaneness is not meant to suggest replicability, repetition, and a lack of idiosyncrasy. Rather, it is a function of the totality of individuated and collective self-expression that occurs in the most experientially situated way. By looking at the memes generated in Egyptian, Syrian, Iraqi, Lebanese, and Palestinian social and political milieus, the objective is to emphasize the extent to which the study of memes informs our understanding of positionality and agency, particularly in relation to authority. Meaning constructed, comprehended, and learned through the contested realms of memes in the Arab world should not be seen as a function of the marketability of ideas, although they are very much commercialized in some cases with attempts to render them consumer products, but rather as fundamental reconfigurations of the political economy of communication in the social media and an irreverent dismissal of discursive monopolies. While the political narrativity embedded in memes may reflect the status quo, counter-revolutionary, pro-establishment, or neoliberal tendencies, in some cases even the co-option of their very own critical perspectives, it is imperative to not overlook their disaggregated multi-sided authorship, and transmutability as a theoretical premise for a practiced, albeit utopian, critical imaginary, both in the Middle East and beyond. Thank you.